I'm Jacob Krueger, and this is the Write Your Screenplay Podcast. This episode, we are going to be talking about Opus by Mark Anthony Green. We're going to be talking about the meaning of Opus and two incredibly useful and valuable tools that you can use as screenwriters. The first is the first image. We're going to be talking about how the first image of Opus works, not only to set the world and pull you into the movie, but also to elevate the movie and start to tie into the broader themes that Mark Anthony Green is exploring. The second thing we're going to be talking about is the use of theme and allegory in Opus and in horror movies in general. Even if you're making a bloody horror movie or, it's just an action movie, people are always deriving meaning out of your storytelling. So we're going to be talking about how you can use theme to elevate your writing, how to use allegory to elevate your writing, and also to own your social political role in the world as a creator of story. The first image of Opus over the title sequence is a series of people rocking out to music. And there's something really beautiful about the way this is shot, but there's also something strange about it because we have a feeling that everybody's at a concert, but we also have a feeling that everybody's totally alone. We have the feeling of all these people being transported by something that they love and believe in and that it's moving them. But we also have this feeling of isolation. They're surrounded by a black screen. We can't feel the rest of the audience around them. And that isolation is going to end up becoming very important within the thematics of what Opus is actually trying to say. The thing about your first image is valuable on multiple different levels in your screenwriting. If you've studied with me, you know about the 4 phases of writing: the me draft, the audience draft, the producer draft, and the reader draft. And the truth is your first image is valuable on all 4 levels of screenwriting. Let's just talk first on the most commercial level. The people who are reading your script are exhausted, jaded, and would really rather be doing anything else. And that's not because they're bad people. That's because if they're a coverage reader, they're reading for pennies on the hour. They're skimming through script after script after script for $50 a script, maybe less, trying to make it through, just trying to make their rent in a very expensive city. And most of the scripts that they read are going to be absolutely terrible. If it is a development executive, a producer, an agent, a manager, right, they have a lot of very important material with people pounding on their door going, you have to read it. They've already worked a 10-hour day, which really means that they have to make a decision. Am I going to read this script? Or am I going to skim this script? Or am I going to send this script out for coverage? Or am I just going to set this script back down on my pile and pick another script? And they're actually making that decision from the very first image. Now, if that seems cruel or wrong or harsh or jaded, you do the same thing. In fact, Netflix has proved that people make a decision about whether they're going to watch a show on Netflix or click to the next show within 10 seconds. So what's really interesting is that what is happening commercially on the producer level is also happening on the audience level, right? That, in fact, your first image is either going to grab your audience and say, yes, you should pay attention to this, or it's going to say, you know what, this is going to be fine. Go ahead and flip. Your first image is also, if it contains your main character, your first image is going to be vitally important in attracting the actor, the A-list star that's going to actually get your show or your movie greenlit. So the first image of your movie is vitally important, and then the first image that contains the star is equally vitally important. So this is just the commercial level of this, right? If we want to sell our screenplays, we need to have great first images, great first page, great first 10 pages. And in fact, if you don't have that, It doesn't matter how brilliant your trick ending is. It doesn't matter what crazy thing happens at the sea change. It doesn't matter how brilliant your thematics are. It doesn't matter how beautiful your dialogue is. If you are not hooking them from that first image on that first page and inside that first 10 pages, then no one's going to make it to the beautiful stuff you have at the end, which means that your first image is where you should be devoting the most time, the most energy, the most rewriting. On the commercial level, on the attracting actors level, on the attracting directors level, your first image and the first page of your script are the most important. They're also the most important on the me-draft level, for yourself. Because when you come up with a really powerful first image, you are setting the world and the feeling of your movie or your show. And you're not just setting it for your audience, you're setting it for yourself. You're giving yourself a lens through which to see everything else that you write. You're giving yourself a feeling of this is the script and this is not the script. And so the more specific your first image is, the more you know everything you write beyond that, whether it is growing organically out of it, whether it feels like it's the same movie, or whether it feels like it's something else. So the first image as a writer can help you keep focused within the world and the tone of your piece. And of course, the first image can also connect to the theme of your piece. So I'm going to go out on a limb and tell you my belief that Opus is not meant to be the story of a eccentric. I won't tell you more. I'm going to go as far as to tell you that Opus is not the story of an eccentric, megalomaniacal, narcissistic musician, even though that is the character that is played by John Malkovich so brilliantly in the piece. I'm going to go so far as to tell you that Opus, to me, is about America. Opus is about our current political situation. Opus is about the way that we fall into these cult-like followings that divide and dehumanize us. And most of all, Opus is about the complicity of the press and the forces of our society that make this happen. And all of that begins with this first image. How, you might ask, how is this first image about our political situation? Isn't this first image about the hero worship of this fantastic musician? Isn't this first image about the feelings that we all have at a concert? Isn't this first image about the tribalistic, transformative power of celebrity and music and fame? And I would say yes. But it's also about the isolation of our phones and our social media that make all of what we're currently going through as a society possible, right? And so all that is starting from the very first image. And out of that first image, Mark Anthony Green is going to start to use some mirrors, and we're going to see other images that are like it. For example, we're going to see when they all get to Alfred Moretti, John Malkovich's character's compound, we're going to see a matching image of all of these press characters who have been invited, and they're all on video. And they're all, with the exception of one who's getting a massage, they are all alone, rocking out to a song that they are listening to, or brushing their teeth, or whatever, going through their own experience of a song that Moretti has set up to play for them in their rooms, right? And so we get this mirrored image that relates to the first image. And there's an amazing thing that happens in the human brain when we see one image and another image that feel related to each other, is that we create a chain between the two of them. And that out of that chain, we start to get meaning. So this is what's really cool. If you nail your first image, like Mark Anthony Green does in Opus, you are helping yourself on so many different levels. Number one, you're helping yourself commercially, like, hey, we're going to actually get a reader to go, I'm going to read this. I'm excited. You're going to get a producer to go, oh, I want to read this. I'm excited. You're going to get a star to go, oh, I want to read this. I'm excited. A director to go, oh, I want to read this. I'm excited. Well, that's already a huge win. But you're also much more likely to get yourself to go, I want to read this. I want to write this. I'm excited. You're going to set a world for the piece. You're going to set an emotional world for the piece. You're going to set a tone for the piece. You're going to create a feeling that you now have to replicate and expand upon. So you now have a goal for your script. And if you've really done your first image right, you can start to mine that first image and play with it and riff on other images that are similar or different or related or contrasting. And what both you and your audience will do is start to create structure by tying these related images together into a chain of meaning. This is one of the ways that Opus is extremely successful. Now I'm going to start breaking down the structure of how this script works so we can better understand the meaning of Opus and also the way that relates to the idea of theme and allegory, and particularly that theme of complicity that I have mentioned to you. Now, in order to do this, this is when the spoilers are going to start. So if you don't want to know the spoilers, this is a good time to hit pause and come back to me later. Okay. So who's the main character of Opus? Well, we would probably say it's Io Edebiri, although I'm going to raise some questions about that later when we start to talk about the structure. So Io Edebiri plays Ariel Acton, a brilliant young journalist of such great talent, incisiveness, curiosity, creativity, naivete, and passion, who is under the thumb of her unhappy, narcissistic boss, Stan Sullivan. In other words, Io's playing the same character she plays on The Bear, except this time, instead of being a young chef, she's a young journalist. Which, as a little side note, is an interesting thing to understand about actors, is that actors, producers, managers, directors, they all have themes, just like you have themes. And they tend to be attracted to certain themes in the parts that they play. Not every actor is moving in exactly as parallel a direction as Io Edebiri is, but if you think of, for example, of an actor like George Clooney and the dozens of movies, if not more, that he's been in that are about the theme of identity, for example, right? And so if you can start to watch the patterns that actors are falling into, or directors or producers, you can, or even yourself, you can start to go, oh, like, these are my people, right? This is the actor that's going to get what I'm doing. This is the actor who's going to be perfect for this role. This is the director who's going to understand what this movie's about because they're on the same theme you are. So Io Edebiri is playing this wonderful, well-intentioned young journalist, and all she wants to eventually write a great book. She wants people to know how good she is, and she really wants to be a great journalist. She's extremely creative, and our first image of Io, she is pitching, or I should say Ariel, the first image we have of Ariel, she is pitching a brilliant idea that her boss is very much enamored with and immediately assigns to another writer. So we instantly know who she is and what her problem is. And in the allegorical theme, this complicity theme that's running through Opus, Io Edebiri's character, Ariel, represents the kind of journalism that we should aspire to. Journalism that's unbiased, journalism that is not swayed by fame and celebrity, journalism that is trying to get to the root of the story, and journalism driven by the work ethic and passion of people who actually care about the truth. And that's what she symbolizes. And what every other character in the piece symbolizes is the kind of journalism that we're mostly seeing in our country, unfortunately, right? The overtly complicit journalism, right? That is using celebrity and fame and these cult-like personalities, including a certain unnamed leader that I believe Alfred Moretti is intended to be a stand-in for allegorically, that all of these journalists are riding the bootstraps of his fame in order to sell themselves and their articles, right? And they are so focused on his celebrity that they are unaware that they're literally killing themselves. Right? Because what's going to happen, and it's not going to be a surprise if you've ever seen a horror movie before, because this is a very familiar last girl plot, right? What's going to happen? Let's get a bunch of people together. We're going to have basically two of them who are actually characters, right? We've got Ariel and we got her boss who are basically characters. Everybody else is basically a body. Now, we have brilliant actors in this piece, and those actors help to distinguish them, but they are basically there to be killed. And they all have their own little nice or nasty thing. They're all their own little take on what a journalist is, but they're all basically starfuckers. So we got a bunch of starfuckers. We've got Io. For reasons that we will never know, Alfred Moretti comes back out of hiding after 30 years. No one has seen him. He is the most famous musician in the world, and he has released a new album in his usual eccentric way, and he's invited a handful of the most important journalists in the world to hear it, and some random girl that no one's ever heard of. Mark Anthony Green worked very hard to try to justify this. In fact, there's a whole other character, a very creepy guy who shows up to kind of welcome them, who has his own weird backstory about being discovered out of nowhere and getting a call from Alfred Moretti to come join him, and just being a teacher and suddenly being thrust into the spotlight of this famous man. So that is the writer going like, hey, I know I got a problem here. I know this doesn't make sense that she's invited, and trying to answer it. But that's not actually the strongest way to answer that kind of problem. So if you have that kind of thing going on in your own screenwriting, where you're like, I got to get Ariel there, the best thing that you can do is actually to have somebody else raise the question. If you watch the movie, one of the weird little gaps that you're going to notice is she has an extremely narcissistic, self-centered, self-important boss. And he gets an invitation, which he expects and deserves. And then, like, the lowest person on his totem pole randomly gets an invitation. And we sometimes, when we know we're forcing things, we have the urge to push through them, right? To go like, okay, let's just get past that. But actually, there's a huge opportunity there, right? Because if the writer just sits in that for a moment and allows that dynamic to develop, how does Stan Sullivan feel about the fact that Io got invited? How does it make him feel that somebody this low should come too? Then he becomes a more specific character, and the plot point, which is a little bit forced, becomes less important than the relational experience, where suddenly there's this new pressure on their relationship that didn't exist before, right? That allows different levels of interrelational pressure between these two characters that will start to distinguish them, right? So this is a really important lesson. You don't want to rush past the relational stuff to get to the plot stuff. Because if Opus has a weakness, its weakness is that its characters are not fully characters. But part of the reason that they're not fully characters is that they are spending so much time reacting to the plot that it's really up to the actors to try to fill out these shells that are essentially bodies meant to be killed. Now, I don't want this to sound like criticism, because I really like what Mark Anthony Green is doing here. See, he's trying to tell an allegory, and he's giving you some very clear archetypes to follow so you can understand what he's trying to say. Over the course of the piece, these press people are going to start to be murdered. The first is murdered on closed caption television. We see it in that mirror that I was telling you about to that very first image. We have the first image, this isolation and rocking it out. Then we have that image gets mirrored, right? But it's not exactly the same. Some are rocking it out, some are brushing their teeth, one's getting a massage. And he gets murdered in the middle of his massage, right? So we haven't just mirrored and duplicated it. We've elevated it. We've escalated it, right? And this is the first murder, and he doesn't show up again, right? And then pretty soon, another one's having some kind of asthmatic attack, and she kind of disappears. And again, we're in the world of allegory, right? An allegory is a story that is meant to be a stand-in for a larger political issue, right? Or a social issue or moral issue, right? That we're going to tell this story so that you can understand what we're saying about that story, right? So all these people start to be murdered, but the press is so focused on Moretti's fame and what he can do for them that they're unable to see the obvious that's happening, right? They are so starstruck and so eager to benefit from his fame and so needy of the importance of having been invited to be in the presence of a great man that they're literally unable to see that he is killing them. And of course, this is exactly what is happening, at least as I see it, to our press today. And I would argue, as Mark Anthony Green says it, to our press today, right? That we actually saw the exact same thing happening. It's like, well, he's killing the press. No, but we should still report on him, right? We got to put him front and center. He's famous. He's the most famous man in the world, and people want to hear about him. You can see there's an allegorical parallel happening here. Now, against all this, we have Ariel. And Ariel is going, hey, boss, how about if I just write a little companion piece to your thing? Because this is obviously a freaking cult. And I want to expose this cult. And again, I think that cult is a stand-in for another cult. They call themselves levelers. I think it's a stand-in for another group that we might call a cult, right? That is also in worship of a pretty complicated man. So she's going, hey, I think this is a cult. I think we have to talk about what's actually happening here. Hey, I think there's some really crazy stories here that we need to look at and report on. And pretty soon she's put together, hey, some of us are not coming back. Her boss gets shot through with an arrow. And even then, he's pretty sure it was an accident and that they're not coming for him. And she's going, I am telling you, this is not an accident, right? So she's put it all together. And when they fail to believe her, she is going to decide on her own that she is leaving. She's not putting up with this anymore. She is going to save herself. She's going to hold on to her integrity. She is not going to be like them. But then she too gets manipulated. See, she's formed a relationship with a sweet young girl who lives on the compound who just really wants Ariel to see her puppet show. And so being a good person, she agrees to go. And of course, the puppet show is going to turn into a total bloodbath where everybody's going to get slaughtered. And then it's going to break into even crazier cult shit, mass sacrifice, and it's going to be crazy and bloody and gross. And at the last minute, one of the disciples is going to slip Ariel a knife. And Ariel uses the knife to free herself and escape. So if the movie ended here, this would be a movie about, to use the metaphor of the piece, there are a lot of oysters that don't have pearls in them, but Ariel is a pearl. And it would be about the one pearl who escaped, right, to bring the story back to the people and share the truth. But Opus has a little coda at the end of it. So when we cut 2 years later, it's now Ariel who is the most famous author in the world. because she has written this piece, this nonfiction book about the cult and about her experience there and about Moretti. And she gets invited by Moretti to meet him in prison, where she finds out the truth, which is that she is complicit. The knife wasn't slipped to her by accident. The knife was slipped to her on purpose as part of the plan. They needed her last girl story to get this craziness out into the world. All the people that she believed had committed suicide and what looked like a mass suicide. In fact, their toast had not been poisoned, but rather champagne. And now they have disappeared out into the world where they are waiting and gathering power, right? Now, this is not a perfect allegory, right? The metaphors are a little mushy. But I believe what Mark Anthony Green is trying to say is that it's not just the star-fucking press that is complicit, right? That even the well-intentioned, unbiased, or attempting to be unbiased press is still being manipulated by these greater powers out of their own need to be recognized, right? And so what we end up is with a good person compromised and complicit in helping the ideals of a madman spread through a society, right? So I believe you can probably put together the pieces and see how this is an allegory and see what the writer is really trying to say and see how that elevates the horror, right? And so this is a term you're going to hear a lot, elevated horror. Horror is an extremely hot genre right now. So if you love horror, it's a great time to write one. But the horror that most people are looking for, right? There's all kinds of horror, right? There are Chucky movies too, right? But the movies that a lot of people are looking for are elevated horror. So let's talk for a moment about what is elevated horror. The concept of elevated horror is that it's not just the blood and gore, it's that it actually means something. Elevated horror might be a movie like Hereditary, where we're looking at the question of mental illness and fate and the question of, are you just a pawn in some hereditary game? It might be a movie like A Quiet Place, which is elevated relationally. It's a story about the silence within families and the destructive power of that, and that's elevated into a horror film where you literally cannot make a sound. And finally, there are movies like Opus, where the elevation is actually not happening on the character level, but rather on the allegorical, metaphorical level, where the film is about something bigger, right? It's a container to deliver a message, right? And that's what we're actually seeing with Opus, right? And that's why this film, which is not perfect in its structure, attracted this incredible cast, because it's an opportunity within a genre that people wildly consume to actually say something that potentially matters about complicity, the complicity of the press, and our own complicity, right? And the way that the isolated channels of information and adoration in our society have allowed this kind of cult-like following to grow, and the way our press and fame and celebrity have gotten mixed together make us all complicit in the society that we've created for each other. Now, one last piece I want to talk about before we move on, because I told you this is not a structurally perfect movie, and I told you, well, who's the main character? And I said, well, I guess it's Ariel. But why is it so complicated? Well, this is a hard structure because, number one, we're following a very traditional pattern, right? This is how all of these movies work. Most of these characters literally could be like wearing the odd colored shirt on a Star Trek episode. These people are literally marked for death from the moment we see them, and they're literally just body count. Now, as I mentioned before, if the writer just sits in the character a little bit more, right, does a little bit less with exposition and does a little bit more with the games that are happening in the present, and the way that they're putting pressure on each other in the present, well, that would elevate this movie to one other level because it would let them feel like just more than bodies. The next level of that, though, is that even though Ariel is primarily the main character. She's certainly the focus. The entire movie is actually being driven by Moretti. He's actually the main character, and he actually gets to do all the coolest stuff. He has some of the most incredible, hammiest sequences, right? And you get to see John Malkovich just being completely unhinged in a wonderful way. It is his desires that have driven everybody there. It is his choices that everybody is reacting to. And even Ariel is primarily reacting to and being driven by the choices that another character has made. And usually when that's happening, it means you have a structural problem. Because for me, Opus is working brilliantly on an allegorical level. But it's not actually working perfectly on a structural level. On a structural level, it's both predictable, and on a character level, the character's journey feels thin. Allegorically, she goes on a huge journey to realize she's complicit. And that's a twist at the end for her. But over the course of the movie, we can't really feel the structure of her change because everything that's happened to her is part of somebody else's plan. What's interesting, I mentioned Hereditary earlier, and you can go back and listen to my podcast on Hereditary. Well, that's also a movie about someone who is under somebody else's spell. He's literally being manipulated by a spirit and a cult. But neither he nor we know it, and we can feel the character's journey. We can feel his change because we can understand his want. With Ariel's character, if you wanted to elevate this, not just on the allegorical level, but on the interpersonal level, it starts by deciding, what does she really want? Does she want to be close to Moretti? Does she want her boss's respect? Does she want to write her book? Does she want to figure out what's going on? Does she want to take care of this little girl? You see, she has 5 different wants. And she acts in relation to all of those wants. She makes a lot of choices in relation to the little girl. She tries to fight for her article with her boss. There's a moment where she slips out of her room and goes on a journey to try to figure out what's really going on. I didn't even mention number 6, where she wants to survive. But what we don't have is that super objective that's tying it all together. We don't actually know, is knowing what's going on more or less important than her boss's respect? And is that more or less important than the little girl? Whereas if we took any one of these and elevated it, right, even if it was the little girl, right, we know at the end she's going to choose the little girl over her own survival. She's going to choose not hurting a little girl's feelings. She knows that people are being murdered. She's going to choose not hurting a little girl's feelings over her own survival. Now, that's a really brilliant choice, but in the film, it doesn't feel smart. It doesn't feel earned, right? In fact, it feels dumb. And that is a trope of these kinds of films, but it doesn't need to be. Because if you decide the thing that matters is that little girl, and you really build a couple of scenes where we can see the relationship growing and how she is trying to protect the little girl from the cult, you might find a better way to get her to show up, not out of, I guess I don't want to hurt the girl's feelings, but out of actual genuine love and trying to do the thing that matters most to her. Similarly, you could choose to not escalate the girl. You could decide that the thing that matters is the book. And we could watch the choices and the dangerous choices that she makes, not to try to escape, but to try to write the book. And if that's the case, you might not even need the little girl, because it might be to write the book that makes her ultimately decide to go to the puppet show, right? So once you figure out what the real thing your character wants, you can start to ask, how do all the other choices they're making build around that? And if you do that, suddenly the character's going to start to come into focus, and she's going to start to feel like the main character. What's really beautiful about looking at a movie like this that's great but imperfect is it shows you a film that's kind of probably similar to a lot of the pieces that you're writing, right? That's brilliant but imperfect, that actually could probably use another rewrite, even though it's already wildly entertaining. And so when you see something like that, you can start to go, okay, is my character functioning as a character, or are they just functioning on the allegorical level? If they're just functioning on the allegorical level, what happens if I get a little bit deeper into them as a character? What if I just pause a moment to realize that there's got to be a question of why did she get invited? Maybe if I just pause a little bit to realize that that's got to put pressure on her relationship with her boss. Maybe if I just pause a little to realize that all these other journalists probably also have their own point of view about why she's there. And underneath all that there's got to be a want that's pulling her through the story. Now, suddenly what's going to happen is not only is she going to come into focus as a character, and not just as an idea, but slowly all the other characters are as well. And this is the most important lesson that I want to leave you with. Just as Mark Anthony Green took this very first image and then riffed on it and elevated it in order to mine the allegorical meaning of the piece, so too can you take literally any element that exists in your character and mine it and play with it. We often have the urge to get additive in order to build more character, right? She also wants this, and she also has this relationship with this little girl, and she also wants this, and she's got to survive, and. And we forget that the answer is already there at the very beginning. With her need for respect and this simple desire just to write a book. And that the theme is naturally going to tie into that because the theme grows out of you. So I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to learn more about this kind of approach to screenwriting, come study with me. I have some incredible classes starting up in the fall, as well as our ProTrack mentorship program, which pairs you one-on-one with a professional writer who will mentor you through your entire career for the tiniest fraction of what you would pay for grad school. In addition, we have a free class every single Thursday Night Write, where you can join a community of writers from all over the world, all online, coming together to learn and study and write. So come check it out. And until then, happy writing.